The field had been ploughed and then left alone for the winter, and the earth had gone the colour of wet cardboard. It was November. Northamptonshire in November does not perform for anyone. The hedges were bare, the light was already thinning at 3 in the afternoon, and the ground pulled at your boots with every step in a way that made conversation difficult and dignity impossible. Lady Sarah Spencer was 22 years old, and she was walking a prince across that field. She was good at this. That is the thing people forget about her now, if they remember her at all. Sarah Spencer was the confident one. She was the eldest, she rode hard, she talked fast. She had a laugh that carried across a room, and a habit of saying the thing that everyone else in the room had decided not to say. She had been thrown out of one of the best girls' schools in England, and she treated that fact as a piece of luggage rather than a wound. When she walked a man across a ploughed field, she did it as though the field belonged to her, which in a sense it did, because behind them stood Althorpe, 500 acres of it, and the Spencers had been at Althorpe since before the Windsors had been anything at all. The prince beside her was 29. He had been the most eligible bachelor in the world for a decade, and he was already exhausted by it. The shoot that weekend had been arranged partly for him and partly around him. He was there because Sarah had asked him, and because he had said yes, and everyone at Althorpe that weekend understood, in the way that everyone in that world understands things without being told, that the question of what exactly was happening between the Prince of Wales and the eldest Spencer daughter was the only real subject of the visit. And trailing behind them, in the wrong shoes for the mud, was Sarah's youngest sister. She was 16. She had come home from school for the weekend. She had been told there would be a shooting party, and she had been told who was coming, and she had done what any 16-year-old does when told to stay out of the way, which is to find a reason to not quite stay out of the way. She was tall already, and she had not grown into it. She looked at people from under her fringe, and then looked at the floor. Her name was Diana. Nobody photographed that afternoon. There is no footage. What survives is the memory of the people who were there, and one line that the prince gave to an interviewer 4 years later, when the world had become extremely interested in the question of when he had first noticed her. He remembered a jolly and amusing and attractive 16-year-old, full of fun. He remembered thinking, apparently, that she was rather a nice girl. That is the whole record of it. A cold field, a bored teenager, a prince being polite about somebody's little sister. And the person who put all three of them in that field was Sarah. She would say it herself. Later, once the engagement had been announced, and the entire British press was standing on her doorstep looking for a quote. She said she was Cupid. She said she had introduced them. She said it with the particular brightness of a woman who has understood, several seconds too late, that the sentence is going to follow her for the rest of her life. Because here is what happened in the 4 years between that ploughed field and that doorstep. Sarah Spencer, the eldest, the loud one, the one everybody in the family and everybody at court assumed would be the Spencer who mattered, did something in the spring of 1978 that made her, in the eyes of the institution she had been circling, permanently untrustworthy. It took her about 90 minutes. She sat down with 2 journalists in a flat in London. She answered their questions honestly, and she told them the truth about a royal romance and the truth about her own health. And both of those truths were things that women in her position were expected to carry to the grave in silence. She was not vindictive. She was not paid. She did not sell a story. She simply answered the questions she was asked, in the way that had always worked for her, which was directly. And the machine, which had been watching her with cautious approval for a year, closed like a door in a draft. What nobody at the palace could have predicted, and what makes this story worth 2.5 hours of your afternoon, is that the girl in the wrong shoes at the back of that field would marry the prince 3 years later, which meant that from the 29th of July 1981, the institution had a permanent structural problem sitting in the family pews. The woman closest by blood to the Princess of Wales, her eldest sister, her confidant, the person she rang when things went wrong, was a woman who had already proven, in public, on the record, that she would answer a journalist's question with the truth. If you are enjoying this so far, do me a favor and hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. It genuinely helps this channel reach the people who care about this kind of history, and I read every one of them. Now, there were 2 Spencer sisters, and the palace felt very differently about each of them. And understanding that difference is understanding the entire architecture of what happened to Diana over the following 16 years. The other sister was Jane. 2 years younger than Sarah, 2 years older than Diana. Quiet where Sarah was loud. Careful where Sarah was direct. And in April of 1978, in the same season that Sarah's interview was detonating in the newspapers, Jane Spencer married a man called Robert Fellows. Robert Fellows was the son of the land agent at Sandringham. He had grown up on the estate, gone to Eton, served in the Scots Guards, worked in the city, and then in 1977 had been brought into the royal household as an assistant private secretary to the Queen. By 1990 he would be the Queen's private secretary, which is not a job title so much as a description of who actually operates the British monarchy on a Tuesday morning. He would hold that post through the entire collapse of the Wales marriage. He would be the man who had to ask his own sister-in-law whether she had cooperated with a book that was tearing the family apart. So the palace had one Spencer sister inside the building, with a desk and a salary and a grace and favour house, and one Spencer sister outside it, with a documented history of talking to the press. You do not need a conspiracy to understand what follows. You do not need a memo. Institutions do not usually issue memos about this sort of thing. They simply develop preferences, and the preferences harden into habits, and the habits become the weather that everybody lives inside without ever discussing it. The preference at Buckingham Palace, from 1981 onward, was for Jane. Jane understood the building. Jane was married to the building. When the household needed a Spencer to be reasonable, they had one on the payroll. Sarah was invited to everything and trusted with nothing. And Diana, who was drowning inside that marriage almost from the first year, went to Sarah anyway. Of course she did. Diana had lost her mother from the house at 6 years old. She had watched a custody case tear the family apart. She had grown up in a home where the adults were at war and the children were the terrain. In that kind of childhood, the eldest sister is not a sibling, she is a fixed point. Sarah had been at Park House and Althorpe before Diana could remember anything. Sarah had taken her to school. Sarah had told her which teachers were fools. Sarah had had the eating disorder first, in 1977 and 1978, when nobody in Britain, outside a handful of clinicians, had a useful word for it. And Sarah had been ill in a family that did not do illness, and Sarah had come through it. Which meant that when Diana became ill in exactly the same way, 4 years later, inside Buckingham Palace, there was precisely one person in the world she could ring who would not require an explanation. That is why this story matters, and that is why the palace felt the way it felt. Not because Sarah was a threat in any dramatic sense. She never sold a story, she never wrote a book. In the 28 years since her sister's death, she has given almost nothing away, and what she has given, she gave under oath in a courtroom, because a coroner required it of her. The problem with Sarah was simpler and much harder to fix. She was the one person Diana talked to who did not work for them. Let me lay out what is actually coming in the next 2.5 hours, because this is a long story, and it runs across 50 years, and it deserves to be told in order. We are going to start in Norfolk, in a rented house on the Sandringham estate called Park House, where 5 Spencer children were born, and one of them lived for less than a day. We are going to look hard at that death, the boy who was born in January of 1960 and lived roughly 10 hours, because it is the hinge on which the entire family swung. Sarah was 4, Jane was 2. The marriage of their parents did not survive it, not really, and the 2 girls who were old enough to notice grew up watching what happens to a woman who fails to produce what an inheritance requires. The divorce comes next, and it was not a quiet county arrangement, but a public humiliation, conducted in the newspapers, followed by the custody case, in which Frances Roche lost her children, in part because her own mother went into the witness box against her. Ruth, Lady Fermoy, was a lady-in-waiting and close friend of the Queen Mother, and she chose the institution over her daughter. Sarah was 12 when that happened, and she understood every bit of it. Some of what Sarah became, the hardness in her, the refusal to be sentimental, dates from that courtroom. Then Westheath, and then out of Westheath, because Sarah was asked to leave, and this account is going to be honest about why, rather than coy about it. After that a Swiss finishing school, and after that London, where she did the season, worked in an estate agency, and then for the magazine Vogue, and became for about 18 months one of the more visible young women in the country. 1977 and 1978 get the most time, because those 2 years are the whole engine of this video. Sarah met Charles at Ascot in June of 1977. By that autumn, the newspapers had decided she was the front runner. She was ill through most of it, seriously ill, and she went skiing with him at Closters in the February of 1978 while still recovering, and then in the summer she sat down with James Whittaker and Nigel Nelson and gave the interview that ended it. I want to be precise about what she actually said, because it has been mangled for 40 years. She said she was not in love with him. The line that survives is the one about the dustman. She would not marry a man she did not love, she told them, whether he were a dustman or the King of England. She said that if he asked her, she would turn him down. She also talked, openly and without embarrassment, about having been anorexic, which in 1978 was an almost unheard of thing for a young woman of her class to say out loud to a reporter. Read those sentences again and notice something. There is nothing cruel in them. There is nothing disloyal. She was not claiming an engagement that did not exist. She was, if anything, protecting him by making it clear that no engagement was coming. Charles was reportedly furious. The version that has survived has him telling her she had just done something extremely stupid, and I will flag that as reported rather than certain, because the only sources for it are second-hand. But the fury is the interesting part, and we are going to take it apart properly, because the offense was not the content. The offense was the act. She had spoken. In that world, a woman who has been near the air does not speak, ever, about anything, to anyone, for the rest of her natural life. Anna Wallace, who came after her, never spoke. Camilla Shand did not speak for 20 years. The rule was not written down anywhere, and it did not need to be. We are going to look at what happened next, which is that Sarah married a man called Neil McCorquodale in May of 1980, and I want you to hold on to that surname, because it is one of the strangest ironies in this entire family. McCorquodale was the married name of Barbara Cartland. Barbara Cartland's daughter was Rain, and Rain, by 1980, was the second wife of Sarah's father, and the stepmother Diana would come to loathe with a completeness that has become almost folkloric. Sarah married into the family of the woman her sister called Acid Rain. Neil was a relation of Rain's, and I will hedge the exact degree of that relationship because the accounts differ, but the family connection is real, and it is not a coincidence, and it tells you something about how narrow this world actually is. Then we come to the engagement, in February of 1981, and the wedding in July, and the sight of Sarah Spencer standing in St. Paul's Cathedral, watching her 19-year-old sister marry the man she herself had been photographed with 3 years earlier. And after that, 16 years of a marriage disintegrating in public, with Sarah on the outside of it, and Jane on the inside of it, and Diana in the middle, ringing whichever of them she trusted that month. We are going to go through 1992 properly, the Andrew Morton book, the recorded telephone conversations, the separation announced in the House of Commons in December, Robert Fellows asking Diana directly whether she had cooperated with Morton, and Diana denying it, and Fellows taking that denial to the Press Complaints Commission and staking his own reputation on it, and being wrong. We know now that Diana cooperated through an intermediary. We know she recorded tapes. Her sister's husband defended her in good faith, and she had lied to him. What that did to the Fellows' marriage, and to the two Spencer sisters, is one of the least examined wounds in the whole story. We will do the Panorama interview in November of 1995, and the letter the Queen sent in December instructing the couple to divorce, and the removal of the style, Her Royal Highness, in the summer of 1996. And then Paris. The 31st of August, 1997. Sarah and Jane flying out with Prince Charles on a British Aerospace 146 from RAF Northolt to bring their sister's body home. The two of them standing in a hospital corridor in the Piti-Salpêtrière. The flight back. The funeral 6 days later, with Jane reading from the pulpit and Sarah reading beside her, and their brother's eulogy from the same pulpit turning into something the family had not warned anyone about. We will do the years since, which are the years in which Sarah did the actual work. She became a trustee and then the chair of the Diana Princess of Wales Memorial Fund. She was an executor of her sister's estate, and we are going to look honestly at the decision the executors made about the letter of wishes and the godchildren, because it generated real criticism, and it deserves an unflinching account rather than a defensive one. She sat through the Franklin Mint litigation, which the fund pursued in the American courts and lost, at enormous cost. And in 1997, when she went through her sister's belongings, she found a letter. And in 2008, at the Royal Courts of Justice, in front of a jury and a coroner and Mohammed Al-Fayed's counsel, she was asked about it under oath. That is where this ends, with the sister the palace never wanted Diana talking to, standing in a witness box, being made to talk, by the only authority in England that could compel her. Stay with me, this one is worth it. Park House sits on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, a solid Victorian building of 10 bedrooms with a tennis court and an outdoor swimming pool, and a view across flat fields toward a church. It is not a grand house by the standards of the people who lived in it. It was a house you rented from the Queen, and the Spencers rented it, and Frances Roche had been born in it herself in 1936, which is the kind of detail that tells you how tightly wound this particular corner of England was. The marriage that produced the Spencer children was, on the 1st of June 1954, the wedding of the year, Westminster Abbey, 1,700 guests. The Queen was there, and so was the Duke of Edinburgh, and so was the Queen Mother, and the bride was 18 years old. 18. Hold on to that. Frances Roche was clever and impatient and beautiful in a way that photographed extremely well, and she had been raised by a mother, Ruth Fermoy, who had made a career out of proximity to the royal family and had every intention of continuing it. Johnny Althorpe was 30, an equerry to the king and then to the queen, heir to an earldom and to one of the great English houses, and by every account a decent, slow, uncomplicated man who liked farming and photography and did not much like conflict. The thing about a marriage arranged around an inheritance is that it comes with a job specification, and everybody involved knows exactly what the job is. Sarah arrived first, in March of 1955. Jane came 2 years later. 2 daughters is fine. 2 daughters is a good start. 2 daughters is the prologue. And then in January of 1960 a boy was born, and he was named John, and he lived for a matter of hours. There is no way to write about this that does justice to it. He was severely disabled at birth and he died the same day, and he was buried, and the family did not talk about him again in any way that reached the outside world. Sarah was 4 years old. Jane was almost 3. Neither of them would have been told anything useful. They would simply have registered that their mother went away and came back changed, and that the house went quiet in a way it had not been quiet before. What happened after that is the part that curdles. According to accounts the family has never disputed, Frances was sent to Harley Street to be examined. Not Johnny, Frances. She was 23 years old, and she was taken to London so that specialists could establish what was wrong with her, on the working assumption that the failure to produce a living son was a fault located in her body and nowhere else. I flag this as reported rather than documented because the medical records are private and always will be, but multiple accounts including her own family's carry it, and none of them contradict it. Think about what that does to a woman. Think about what it does to a household. And then think about the 2 small girls upstairs who could not possibly have understood the mechanism, but absolutely understood the temperature. Diana was born in July of 1961, at Park House, on a hot afternoon. She was a healthy baby, and she was a girl, and the disappointment was apparently not concealed with any great skill. The story that has followed her all her life is that her parents had not chosen a girl's name and took a week to settle on one, and that she was christened at Sandringham Church rather than in the Abbey, which is a small thing, unless you know how these families read small things. The son arrived 3 years later, Charles Edward Maurice Spencer, born in May of 1964, the heir at last. He was christened at Westminster Abbey with the Queen as godmother. 4 surviving children then. 2 girls who had lived through the bad years, 1 girl born into the wrong end of them, and a boy born into the relief. And a marriage with nothing left in it. One detail about Park House explains more about this family than any amount of psychology. and it is a detail of geography. Park House stands on the Sandringham estate. Not near it, on it. Walk out of the front door, cross the park, and you arrive at Sandringham House itself, where the royal family spend Christmas and the weeks after it, every year, without fail, and have done since the 1860s. Which means that the Spencer children grew up as neighbours. The royal children came over to swim. Park House had an outdoor pool, which was unusual in Norfolk in the 1960s, and Prince Andrew and Prince Edward, who were close in age to Diana and to her brother, used it. There were birthday parties. There were the sort of arrangements that happen between two households with children of similar ages living a short walk apart, where the mothers know each other and the fathers work in the same world, and nobody thinks it is remarkable. Sarah was 5 years older than Andrew, which at that age is an unbridgeable gap, so she was the big girl the little ones were slightly afraid of. Diana was almost exactly Andrew's contemporary. Charles Spencer was between Andrew and Edward. None of these people were awed by the monarchy, because you cannot be awed by children you have seen with their hair wet and a towel round them. Hold that against everything that happened later, because it explains a great deal about the Spencer family's conduct in the 1990s, and it explains why the institution found them so difficult. Most people who come near the royal family arrive from outside and spend the first several years working out the rules. The Spencers had never been outside. Their father had been an equerry to 2 monarchs. Their grandmother was in the Queen Mother's household. Their aunt had been a lady-in-waiting. The family had held offices in royal households on and off for something like 400 years, and there is a decent argument that the Spencers had been grand in England for longer than the Windsors, who had been Saxe-Coburg-Gotha until 1917, and had changed the name because of a war. That is not a small psychological fact. It is the difference between a family who feel privileged to be admitted and a family who feel that they have always been there. When Charles Spencer stood up in Westminster Abbey in 1997 and delivered a eulogy, the palace had not been shown. He was not a commoner defying a monarch. He was the head of a family older than the dynasty in the front pew, standing in a church his ancestors had endowed, saying something about his own sister. And when the household in the 1970s and 80s sorted the Spencer sisters into the safe one and the risk, they were doing it to women who had swum with the princes as children and who had never for 1 second been impressed. Francis met Peter Shand Kidd in 1966. He was married too, with children of his own, and he had inherited a wallpaper business, and he was funny and modern and entirely outside the closed circuit of court appointments and county obligations that Frances had been fitted into at 18. In the autumn of 1967, she left Norfolk for a flat in London. The understanding at the time, on her side at least, was that the children would follow. They did not follow. The divorce that came out of this was not the discreet arrangement that people of that class usually managed. It was a public dismantling. Johnny's side petitioned on the grounds of adultery. Frances counter-petitioned on the grounds of cruelty and lost. And then came the custody hearing, which is where the story acquires the detail that people still cannot quite believe when they hear it for the first time. Ruth, Lady Fermoy, gave evidence against her own daughter. She was a woman of real accomplishment, a trained concert pianist, a founder of the King's Lynn Festival, a lady-in-waiting to the Queen Mother and one of her closest friends across 4 decades. And when the choice arrived between her daughter and the world she had spent her adult life inside, she chose the world. She went into the box, and she supported the case that Frances was not the person who should raise the Spencer children. Johnny got the children. Frances got access. Sarah was 12. I want to sit on that for a moment, rather than rushing past it, because everything that Sarah Spencer became runs directly out of that year. She was old enough to follow the newspapers. She was old enough to hear the servants. She was old enough to understand that a court in London had adjudicated her own mother and found against her, and that her grandmother had helped it happen, and that the reason all of this had been possible was that the Spencers had an earldom coming and the Roches did not. Diana was 6 and remembered the sound of her mother's car on the gravel. Charles was 3 and remembered crying for her at night. Jane at 10 went inward. Sarah at 12 went outward and stayed there. The 4 of them raised each other for the next several years, in the way that children in emptied houses do, with a rota of nannies passing through who were variously kind, absent, or actively unpleasant, and a father who loved them without any visible idea of what to do with them. Sarah was sent to Westheath in Kent, a girls' boarding school in a large house with good grounds and a reputation for turning out competent, cheerful, unthreatening young women. She was neither cheerful nor unthreatening. She was funny and quick, and she made an art out of the specific kind of rebellion that boarding schools cannot easily punish because it is never quite insubordination. And in 1972, she was asked to leave. The reason, which the family has never gone out of its way to deny, was drinking. She had been drinking. She had been caught, and the school took the view it was obliged to take. There are versions of the story that make it sound like an escapade, a midnight bottle of something, a joke that went too far. There are other versions in which it was already something more serious than that. What is not in dispute is that she left the school before she was meant to, and that the family absorbed it in the manner of their class, which was to send her abroad. It is worth being clear about what schools like Westheath were actually for, because a modern viewer will hear the word school and imagine something it was not. Girls of that class, in that decade, were not being educated toward a career. There were exceptions, and there were girls who fought for one and won, but the design of the institution was not aimed at university. It was aimed at producing a young woman who could run a household, manage staff, sit on a committee, write a decent letter, ride, do a little something charitable, and marry appropriately. Academic results were, in the ordinary case, close to irrelevant. Diana famously failed her O-levels twice, and it did not affect her prospects in the smallest degree, because her prospects had never depended on them. What could damage a girl's prospects was reputation. That is why the expulsion mattered, and it is also why it did not matter as much as it would now. A girl asked to leave for drinking was a girl with a slightly awkward story attached to her, and the family fixed it in the standard way, by removing her from the country for a year and letting the story go stale. Switzerland existed for exactly this purpose, but the story does not entirely go stale. It goes into circulation. In a world of perhaps 2,000 families who all know each other, everything is remembered by somebody, and the somebodies include the private secretaries and the ladies in waiting and the mothers of other daughters. So by 1977, when the newspapers installed Sarah Spencer as the frontrunner, there were already people inside the royal household who knew she had left school early and knew why. There were people who knew she had been seriously ill. None of them had to say anything to anybody. The knowledge simply existed in the room. The bride specification for a Prince of Wales at that moment required a young woman about whom nothing at all was known. Sarah Spencer was a girl about whom several things were known, all of them minor, none of them shameful by any sane standard, and all of them disqualifying. Her sister, 4 years later, was 19 years old, had done almost nothing, had lived almost nowhere, and had a documented history consisting of 2 failed sets of examinations and a job in a nursery. That is not a coincidence. That is the specification working as designed. She went to Switzerland, to a finishing school in the mountains, the same one that Diana would attend some years later and hate. Sarah did not stay long either. Nobody in this family ever seems to have stayed anywhere long. Then London. The season, the parties, the flat, the jobs. She worked for a period in an estate agency and later at Vogue, which was the standard route for a well-connected young woman with an eye and no particular professional plan, and by her early 20s, she was a recognizable face in the diary columns. Tall, red-haired, sharp, always at the right thing. And underneath all of it, an illness. Anorexia nervosa was not, in 1976 and 1977, a thing that people talked about in England. It was barely a thing people named. There was no public vocabulary for it, no charity running helplines, no journalism about it except the occasional bewildered feature. In the world Sarah moved in, a young woman who was ill in that way was described as delicate, or as having gone off her food, or as being under the weather, and the household adjusted around her without anyone using a clinical word. She was seriously unwell. She lost a great deal of weight over an extended period. She was treated, and she recovered, and the recovery was slow and imperfect in the way that recoveries generally are. That is as far into it as this account is going to go, and deliberately so. What matters here is not the mechanics of the illness, but two facts about its position in this story. The first is that Sarah was ill during the exact months when she was being written about in every newspaper in Britain as the probable future queen. The second is that 4 years later, inside Buckingham Palace, her youngest sister would develop an eating disorder of her own, and would spend a decade being told by extremely well-born people that there was nothing wrong with her, that a bit of backbone would not cure, and there would be precisely one person in her life who had already lived on the other side of that sentence. That is not a small thing. In a family that did not discuss illness, and in an institution that discussed nothing at all, Sarah Spencer was the only available proof that a person could go all the way down and come back. Which is why, when the palace later decided that Sarah was a risk, they were making a calculation about a leak, and Diana was making a calculation about survival, and the two of them were never once talking about the same thing. Now let us go to Ascot, in June of 1977, where a 22-year-old woman, who had spent most of the previous year unwell, walked into the royal enclosure and met the Prince of Wales. To understand what happened to Sarah Spencer in 1977 and 1978, you have to understand the atmosphere around Prince Charles in those particular years, because it was not normal, and everyone involved knew it was not normal. He was going to be 30 in November of 1978. He had said in an interview at 20 that 30 was about the right age for a man in his position to marry, which was a throwaway line, and which the entire British press then treated as a legally binding contract. From about 1976 onward, the coverage stopped being about him and started being about the vacancy. Every young woman photographed within 6 feet of him was a candidate. Every candidate was measured against a list of requirements that nobody had ever published, and everybody understood. The requirements were roughly these: Protestant, aristocratic or close enough, young, and, in the phrase that was used quite openly at the time, with no past. That last one did the most damage. What it meant in practice was that a woman who had lived any kind of adult life, who had had relationships, who had been written about, who had a history of any sort that a newspaper could reconstruct, was disqualified. Not by a rule, by an atmosphere. Lord Mountbatten, who advised Charles on this at length, and whose letters have been published, was explicit about the double standard involved. He thought Charles should have a period of freedom before settling down, and he thought the girl at the end of it should be sweet-charactered and unspoilt, and, in effect, blank. Sarah Spencer was many things, and blank was not one of them. She met him at Ascot in June of 1977. She was 22. She had been out of the finishing school and into London life for several years. She was working, she was known, she was recovering from a serious illness that a number of people in her circle knew about. She was also, in the specific arithmetic that mattered, extremely eligible. Her father was an earl with one of the great houses. Her grandmother was in the Queen Mother's household. Her family had been leasing a house on the Sandringham estate for 2 decades. She had known these people since childhood. What followed was about a year of visible closeness. She was at Balmoral. She was at the polo. She went to Closters with him in February of 1978 on a skiing party. She was photographed enough that by the winter, the papers had installed her as the front runner and started running the sort of profile pieces that get written when an editor is preparing for an announcement. And through most of it she was not well. That is the part the coverage did not carry, because the coverage did not have the language for it, and because the people who did know were not the sort of people who told journalists things. Here is what I think was actually happening, and I want to be clear that this is a reading of the evidence rather than a claim to certainty. Sarah Spencer was smart. Everybody who dealt with her says so. She was the sort of person who understood a room in about 4 seconds. She had been raised inside this exact world. She had watched her own mother be destroyed by it in a courtroom, and she had watched her grandmother choose the institution over her own child. She was not naive about what the Prince of Wales's wife was for. She knew that the job involved being examined, being adjusted, being narrated, and being expected to produce sons, and she knew from her family's own history exactly what happened to a woman who failed the last part. She also knew she was disqualified. She had been thrown out of school. She had been ill. She had been photographed on a great many nights out. Under the unwritten specification that governed that vacancy, she was never a serious candidate, whatever the Daily Express thought. To understand why she talked at all, you have to understand what Fleet Street was in 1978, because it was not what it became. There were royal correspondents, and there had been since the 1950s, but the relationship between them and the aristocratic world they covered was closer to a social arrangement than to a siege. They went to the same parties. They knew each other's families. A young woman of good background who found herself in the diary columns did not regard the men writing them as enemies, because they were not, yet. James Whittaker was the most persistent of them. He came from a comfortable background himself. He had been to a decent school, and he covered the royal family for the better part of 30 years, first for the Star, and later for the Mirror, and he was very good at it. He was also, by every account of everyone who dealt with him, including the people he wrote about, personally likable. He was fat and pink and cheerful, and he wore loud tweeds, and he was on Christian name terms with half the people he was writing about. That is how the interview happened. It was not an ambush. Whittaker had been around Sarah Spencer for months. She knew him. She talked to him the way you talk to a journalist you have decided is not out to get you, which is to say honestly, at length, and without a great deal of calculation, about how the sentences would look in print alongside a photograph. The tone changed almost immediately afterward, and it never changed back. By 1980, the pack outside Coleherne Court was a different animal, 20 deep, motorbikes, telephoto lenses. By 1982, photographers were in a boat off a beach in the Bahamas taking pictures of a pregnant Princess of Wales in a bikini, and the Queen's press secretary was issuing a formal protest, and it made no difference at all. By 1992, you had recorded telephone conversations of members of the royal family being sold and published, which is a criminal act, and by 2006, you had a royal editor and a private investigator going to prison for intercepting voicemails. So the woman who sat down with Whittaker in 1978 was operating under one set of rules and was judged, for the rest of her life, under another. That does not make her right to have done it. The silence rule inside the royal orbit predates Fleet Street entirely, and she certainly knew it existed, but it does explain the mismatch between how she behaved and how the household reacted, and it explains why she seems to have been genuinely surprised by the consequences. She thought she was being straightforward with a man she knew. The palace saw a Spencer daughter breaking the only rule that has ever really mattered to them, in a magazine, next to a photograph of her face. So when she sat down in the summer of 1978 with James Whittaker and Nigel Nelson, she was not a woman making a blunder. She was, on this reading, a woman closing a door that was going to be closed anyway, and choosing to be the one holding the handle. The interview ran in Woman's Own. Whittaker had been working the Spencer angle for months and had built up an actual relationship with her, which is how these things happened in the 1970s, before the arms race between the palace and the tabloids turned the whole business hostile. She said she was not in love with him. The line that has outlived everything else is the one about the dustman. She would not marry a man she did not love, she told them, whether he were a dustman or the King of England. If he asked her, she said, she would turn him down. And then she talked about being ill. Not in detail, not clinically, but plainly, using the word. In a magazine that sat in every hairdresser in Britain, a 23-year-old earl's daughter said out loud that she had had an eating disorder, at a time when the standard approach among people of her background was to describe the sufferer as having been a bit run down. I have read a great many accounts of this interview, and almost all of them describe it as a catastrophe, a self-inflicted wound, a foolish girl talking herself out of a throne. I think that reading is lazy, and I think it is also unkind, and I think the evidence points somewhere more interesting. Consider the actual sentences. There is nothing in them that damages him. She does not describe his behavior. She does not describe anything that passed between them privately. She does not complain. She does not hint. She does not do any of the things that a woman with a grievance does when she gets a journalist in front of her. She simply removes herself from a race she was being entered into without her consent and, in the process, tells the truth about her own health in a way that would have been useful to a great many young women reading it. The palace did not see it that way. Charles was reportedly furious. The line that has come down to us has him telling her she had just done something extremely stupid, and I am flagging that as reported rather than established, because it comes to us second-hand through people who were not in the room. But the fury itself is not in doubt. The relationship, whatever it had been, was over from that week. And this is the moment that matters for everything that follows, so let me be exact about what the offense was. Nothing she said was untrue. All of it was confirmed by subsequent events, since he did not ask her and she did not marry him. She had betrayed no confidence and described nothing private. What she had done was open her mouth about a royal relationship to a journalist, on the record, with her name printed beside it. In that world, that is the whole crime, and the content is irrelevant. The women who came near the heir did not talk. Not then, not in 10 years, not in 50. Anna Wallis, who was with him in 1979 and 1980, and who walked out of a party at Buckingham Palace after he left her standing alone for most of an evening, has said essentially nothing in 45 years. Camilla Shand said nothing, at all, publicly, until the late 1990s, and even then, only in the most controlled possible way. Georgiana Russell, Davina Sheffield, Amanda Knatchbull, Jane Ward. The list of women who were near him in that decade is long, and the total volume of their public commentary is close to zero. That silence is not an accident, and it is not modesty. It is a condition of admission. You are permitted proximity to the family on the understanding that you will never afterward describe it. Nobody signs anything. Nobody threatens anybody. The understanding simply exists, and everyone inside that world absorbs it in adolescence, the way you absorb which fork to use. Sarah Spencer broke it at 23, in print, with her photograph next to the words. And the institutional memory for this kind of thing is very long indeed, and it is not held by any one person. It is held in the building. Private secretaries change. Press officers change. What does not change is the collective sense, transmitted from one generation of household staff to the next, of who is sound and who is not. From the summer of 1978, Sarah Spencer was not sound. I want to put one more thing beside this, because the timing is almost too neat, and it deserves to be looked at directly. In April of 1978, weeks before or after that interview, depending on which account you follow, Sarah's sister Jane married Robert Fellows at the Guards Chapel. He was already working in the royal household. He would be there for another 21 years, rising to the top of it. So within a matter of months, the same family produced the two poles of the palace's entire attitude to outsiders. One daughter married the machine. The other talked to the press. Nobody planned that. There is no scheme here, no clever family strategy, nothing but two young women making the choices in front of them in the same season. But the effect on the following 20 years was enormous, because it gave the household a ready-made way of sorting Spencers. There was the sensible one, and there was the other one. And when Diana arrived in the family 3 years later, in a state of complete unpreparedness, and started reaching for someone to hold on to, everybody at Buckingham Palace already had a settled view about which of her sisters it would be better for her to reach for. The 2 years between the interview and Sarah's wedding are quiet, and the quiet is itself informative. She dropped out of the newspapers almost entirely. The photographers moved on to the next name on the list, which by 1979 was Anna Wallis, and by early 1980 was Amanda Knatchbull, and by the autumn of 1980 was a 19-year-old kindergarten assistant in a see-through skirt on the steps of a nursery school in Pimlico. Sarah went back to Lincolnshire and Northamptonshire, to the country and the horses, and in due course to Neil McCorquodale. They married on the 17th of May 1980 at St. Mary the Virgin in Great Brington, the Spencer Church, a few hundred yards from the house. Neil was a former Coldstream Guards officer, a farmer and landowner, from a family of Scottish origin and considerable commercial history. He was, by all accounts, the opposite of a public man. That was almost certainly the point. Prince Charles came to the wedding. Think about that for a second. 2 years after she had detonated their relationship in a magazine, he turned up at her wedding, in a morning coat, and stood in a Northamptonshire church and watched her marry someone else. That is not the behavior of a man nursing an injury. Whatever the fury of 1978 had been, It had burned down to something manageable within 24 months, at least on his side. Which raises a question that this story keeps returning to, and I want to name it now so that we can test it as we go. The people who never forgave Sarah were not the principals. Charles came to the wedding. The Queen continued to receive her. Nobody cut her. The people who never forgave her were the staff, the household, the permanent government of the monarchy, the private secretaries and press secretaries, and the whole professional apparatus, whose entire function is the management of what gets said about the family. Principals forgive because principals have feelings. Institutions do not forgive because institutions do not have feelings. They have files. And now hold the surname McCorquodale up to the light, because this is where the family arithmetic becomes almost absurd. Barbara Cartland, the romantic novelist, the woman in pink chiffon with the white Pekingese and the 600-odd books, had been married to Alexander McCorquodale. Their daughter was Rain. Rain married the Earl of Dartmouth, had 4 children, sat on the Greater London Council, and then in the mid-1970s attached herself to Johnny Spencer with a thoroughness that the Spencer children found unbearable. Johnny and Rain married in July of 1976 at Caxton Hall, without telling his children. They found out from the newspapers. The war that followed is well documented, and it was vicious. Rain redecorated Althorpe. Rain sold things out of it, paintings and furniture and books, on the argument, which was not entirely wrong, that the house was falling down and needed money. The children called her Acid Rain. Diana's hostility toward her was total and lasted the better part of 2 decades. Charles Spencer has been public about the depth of it. And into the middle of that war, in 1980, the eldest Spencer daughter married a McCorquodale. Neil was a relation of Rain's, and I am going to hedge the exact degree because the published accounts differ, and I am not going to state a family tree I cannot verify. But the connection is real. Sarah married into the family of the stepmother her siblings loathed, in the stepmother's father's surname, in the Spencer church, with the stepmother presumably in a pew. I do not think this was a political act. I think it was a young woman marrying a man she liked, in a very small world, where everyone is related to everyone. But it tells you how narrow that world was, and it tells you something about Sarah specifically, which is that she was capable of holding a position that her family found impossible, without apparently caring very much what they thought about it. That capacity is going to matter a great deal later, when the person she has to hold a difficult position for is Diana. The war over Althorpe deserves more than the passing mention it usually gets, because it was the formative political education of all 4 Spencer children, and because it is the only conflict in this story in which Sarah's position is genuinely difficult to defend. Johnny Spencer inherited the earldom and the house in 1975, when his father died. Althorpe is a very large building indeed, 16th century at its heart, remodeled repeatedly, stuffed with one of the great private collections of English portraiture, and by the mid-1970s it was in serious trouble. Roofs, damp, death duties, the standard condition of the English country house in that decade, which is why so many of them were pulled down. Rain, Countess of Dartmouth, arrived in his life around then and married him in July of 1976 at Caxton Hall, and his 4 children found out about it from the newspapers. What followed was a decade of open hostility. Rain took control of the house, and she spent money on it, and she raised the money by selling things out of it: paintings, furniture, books from the library, porcelain. The precise inventory has been argued over ever since, and the figures quoted have varied enormously, but the fact of substantial disposals is not in dispute. Her defense, which was made at the time and has been made by others since, is that the house was falling down, that nobody else was doing anything about it, that the money had to come from somewhere, and that Althorpe is standing today partly because of what she did. The children's case was that she was selling their inheritance to redecorate in a style they found vulgar, that she had isolated their father from them, and that she had done all of it with a proprietorial confidence that made the house unbearable to visit. Diana's hostility was the most complete. She was 15 when it started. She called her stepmother Acid Rain, and she meant it. Charles Spencer, then a boy, has written and spoken about the period with lasting anger. And in the middle of all that, in 1980, The eldest daughter married a McCorquodale. I said earlier that I do not think this was a political act, and I still do not. But I want to be honest about how it must have looked from inside that family. Sarah married into the family of the woman her siblings were at war with, in the middle of the war, in the family church, with the enemy in the congregation. If one of your siblings did that, you would have feelings about it. There is a further wrinkle that makes it stranger still. Barbara Cartland, Rain's mother, was therefore connected by marriage to Sarah's husband, and, by the time of the royal wedding in 1981, was going about telling anyone who would listen that she was Diana's step-grandmother, which was technically true, and which the Spencer children found excruciating. She gave interviews. She had opinions about the marriage. She was not invited to the wedding breakfast. Sarah, meanwhile, said nothing about any of it, then or since. That silence is either loyalty to a husband whose family she had married into, or indifference, or simple good sense. Whichever it was, it is the same silence she maintained about everything else for the next 45 years, and it began here, in a family row, long before it was ever tested by anything royal. Rain and Johnny stayed married until his death in 1992. She left Althorpe shortly afterward, under circumstances that were not gracious. And then, in one of the odder turns in this whole story, Diana and Rain reconciled in the mid-1990s, met for lunch regularly, and were on genuinely warm terms in the last years of Diana's life. Sarah's brother did not reconcile. Sarah's position has never been stated. The summer of 1980 is where the story turns, and the strangest thing about it is how little the eldest sister had to do with it. Sarah had made the introduction in a ploughed field 3 years earlier, and then gone off to be married in Lincolnshire. She was pregnant, or close to it. She had a house and horses and a husband who farmed. Whatever her feelings about the Prince of Wales were by 1980, they had been filed. Diana, meanwhile, had spent those 3 years growing up. She had gone to Switzerland and hated it, and come home early. She had done a series of small jobs, cleaning for her sister Sarah among them, which is a detail worth pausing on. In the years between the field and the courtship, Diana Spencer worked as a cleaner in Sarah's London flat. She also nannied, and she taught dance to small children, and eventually took the job at the Young England kindergarten in Pimlico that put her in a photograph that ran on every front page in Britain. She lived at Coleherne Court in Earl's Court, in a flat her mother had bought, sharing with 3 friends. Those were, by every account including her own, the happiest years of her life. In July of 1980, she went to a house party at Petworth, and there was a barbecue, and she sat next to Charles on a hay bale and talked to him about Lord Mountbatten's funeral. Mountbatten had been murdered by the IRA the previous August. She told him that she had watched him walk up the aisle at the funeral and thought how sad he looked and how much he needed someone to look after him. Charles later described that conversation as the moment. Diana later described it as the moment. Whether it happened quite as cleanly as both of them remembered it is a question you can ask about any origin story that gets told 100 times. But something happened on that hay bale, and by the autumn she was at Balmoral, sitting on a riverbank watching him fish, being watched in turn through binoculars by James Whittaker from the other side of the Dee. The press siege of Coleherne Court began in September, and it did not stop for 17 years. I want to note something about that autumn that goes to the heart of this video. When the papers worked out who she was, one of the first things every royal correspondent in Fleet Street did was check the file. And the file said Spencer, and the file said that this girl's eldest sister had been the front-runner 3 years earlier and had blown it by talking to Woman's Own. So the coverage of Diana was framed, from almost the first week, against Sarah. The sensible comparison, the cautionary tale, the reporters who wrote about the shy 19-year-old in the see-through skirt were the same reporters who had sat in a flat with her sister and written down the dustman line. James Whittaker covered both. He is on record about both. Which means the palace, when it began assessing this new girl in the autumn of 1980, was not looking at a blank sheet. They were looking at the second Spencer daughter to be considered for the job in 3 years, and they had a live memory of how the first one had turned out. The engagement was announced on the 24th of February 1981. He had proposed at Windsor earlier that month, in the nursery, and she had said yes, and then laughed. and he had told her to go away and think about it, and she had gone to Australia with her mother for 3 weeks, instead of thinking about it. Then came the television interview on the day of the announcement, standing in the gardens at Buckingham Palace, and the question about whether they were in love, and her immediate yes, and his pause. And then the 4 words that have followed him for 45 years. Whatever in love means. It has been quoted against him 10,000 times, and it deserves a slightly more careful reading than it usually gets. He was a man who had been raised to distrust his own feelings, who had been publicly hunted for a decade over the question of whom he would marry, who was standing on a lawn with a 19-year-old he barely knew, being asked to certify an emotion on camera for the evening news. What came out was the sound of a man trying to be accurate in a situation that did not want accuracy. But the 19-year-old heard it too, and she said afterward that it went through her like a knife. Diana moved into Clarence House and then into Buckingham Palace to wait out the 5 months until the wedding. And this is where the machinery of the thing really shows itself, because what happened to her in those 5 months is the closest the story comes to a documented case of institutional neglect. She was given no preparation, no induction, no formal instruction of any kind about what the job involved. There was no course, no mentor, no schedule of briefings. She was given a room and a lady in waiting and a great deal of time. Her flatmates were gone. Her mother was in Scotland. Her father was at Althorpe with Rain. She was 19, alone in a building of 1,000 rooms with several hundred staff who all knew each other and none of whom knew her, being fitted for a dress and taught to curtsy and told very little else. The eating disorder started in that period. Diana was consistent about this in every account she ever gave. It began in the months between the engagement and the wedding, inside the palace, and it lasted for most of a decade. And so we arrive at the question this entire video exists to answer. In that condition, in that building, in that year, who did she have? Her mother, at a distance, in Scotland, with a history of having been removed from her children by a court, and a residual guilt about it, that made her, by many accounts, an uncertain source of help. Ruth Fermoy, her grandmother, who was in the Queen Mother's household and had promoted the match, and who would, 11 years later, help the palace against her. A brother, Charles, 17 years old, and still at school. Jane, married to a man who worked upstairs in that same building. And her sister Sarah, in Lincolnshire, married to a farmer, no royal connection whatsoever, who had already gone through the same illness and out the other side, and who had already demonstrated that she would say what she thought, regardless of who was listening. You already know which one she called. There is a scene that has come down to us from the days immediately before the wedding, and I am going to give it to you with the caveat it deserves, because it comes from the Morton book and therefore from Diana herself, filtered through an intermediary and a ghostwriter. Diana, in the last week, told her sisters that she could not do it, that she had made a mistake, that she wanted to call it off. And the answer she got, attributed in most accounts to Sarah, was that it was too late, because her face was already on the tea towels. Bad luck, Dutch. Your face is on the tea towels now. Dutch was the family nickname, short for Duchess, given to her as a small girl for reasons that varied depending on who was telling it. Now, that line has been used for 4 decades as evidence of Spencer callousness, and I think that is a serious misreading of both the moment and the woman. Look at it again. It is not cruelty. It is the specific black humor of a family that had been through a divorce court and a custody case and a dead brother, and had learned that sentiment does not change outcomes. It was also, in the narrowest sense, true. The wedding was 6 days away. There were 2,500 people invited to St. Paul's. 600,000 people were going to line the route, and 750 million people were going to watch it on television. Whatever the correct answer to Diana's panic was, there was no version of it that a 26-year-old sister in a Northamptonshire bedroom could deliver. But it also tells you what Sarah was and what she was not. She was not soft. She was not going to sit on the bed and stroke her sister's hair and tell her it would all be fine. She was going to tell her the truth and make a joke out of it, which is a form of love that some people find sustaining and others find unbearable, and Diana, at 19, needed something else entirely. Hold that thought, because it complicates the whole picture. The palace's problem with Sarah was that she talked. Diana's problem with Sarah, at least in that period, was that she did not coddle. The wedding was on the 29th of July, 1981. Sarah was in St. Paul's Cathedral, watching her 20-year-old sister marry the man she herself had been on the front pages with 3 years earlier, in front of the largest television audience assembled to that date for anything. I have never seen a satisfactory account of what that was like for her, because she has never given one. There is no interview, no memoir, no line dropped to a friendly journalist over the following 45 years. If she felt anything complicated that morning, she has kept it entirely to herself, which is either the most disciplined silence in the family, or evidence that she genuinely did not feel anything complicated, and there is no way to know which. What she did say, in the weeks around the engagement, when reporters found her, was the Cupid line. She said she had introduced them. She said she was Cupid. It was cheerful, and it was quotable, and it went everywhere, and it is now more or less the only thing most people know about her. The woman who introduced Diana to Charles. Which is, when you sit with it, a fairly brutal thing to be remembered for. For the next 11 years, the two Spencer sisters occupied positions so different that it is worth drawing the map. Jane Fellows lived at Kensington Palace, not near it, in it. Robert Fellows had a grace and favour house within the palace grounds, which is what senior members of the household get, and so from the early 1980s onward, the Princess of Wales lived in apartments 8 and 9, and her sister lived a short walk across the same enclosed compound, behind the same gates, inside the same security perimeter, married to the man who would shortly be running the Queen's office. Sarah McCorquodale lived in Lincolnshire, in a farmhouse, with a husband who had no connection to any of it. Her first child, Emily, was born in 1983. Her son George came in 1984, 4 months after Prince Harry. Her second daughter, Celia, was born in 1989. She was raising 3 children in the country, and she came to London when she came to London. Since the geography matters, let me describe it properly, because most people picture Kensington Palace as a single grand building, and it is nothing of the sort. It is a compound. Behind the gates off Kensington High Street and the Bayswater Road, there is a state apartment block that the public can visit, and then there is everything else, which is a collection of houses, apartments, cottages, and converted service buildings, laid out around courtyards and gardens, occupied by members of the royal family and by senior members of the household. In the 1980s, the occupants included Princess Margaret in apartment 1A, the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester, Prince and Princess Michael of Kent, various retired officials in grace and favour cottages, and, in apartments 8 and 9 knocked together, the Prince and Princess of Wales. It was called, by people who lived there, the Ant Heap. Robert and Jane Fellows had a house inside the same walls. So the picture is this: a young woman, isolated, unwell, in a marriage that was failing, living in a compound with her sister a short walk away, and her sister's husband walking out of the gate every morning to run the Queen's office, surrounded by elderly royal relations who had all seen this sort of thing before and had views about it, behind a security perimeter, with staff who all knew each other and most of whom had worked in the household longer than she had been alive. There is no privacy in an arrangement like that. There is only discretion, which is different, and which depends entirely on everybody agreeing to keep exercising it. 2 things follow from the geography, and they pull in opposite directions. The first is that Jane was extremely well placed to help. She was there. She could walk across. She did walk across, by all accounts, often. Whatever cooled between them after 1992, the daily physical fact of the 80s was that Diana had a sister within shouting distance. The second is that the proximity was also the problem. Everything that happened in that compound was visible to the compound. A sister who lives inside the walls is a sister whose comings and goings are logged by people who report to somebody. It is not that anybody was spying. It is that in a small, closed community, information moves without anyone deciding to move it. To talk to Sarah, Diana had to make a telephone call or get in a car and drive to Lincolnshire, and both of those things were harder, and both of them were, for exactly that reason, safer. 2 sisters, one inside the walls, one 2 hours up the A1, and the marriage at the centre of it was already failing. It failed early and it failed comprehensively, and the account of exactly how early is now a matter of public record from both sides. Charles told Jonathan Dimbleby, on television, in 1994, that he had resumed his relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles after his marriage had irretrievably broken down, and he placed that breakdown in 1986. Diana placed the trouble much earlier than that, in the honeymoon itself, with the photographs that fell out of the diary and the cufflinks with the entwined initials. There is no need for this account to adjudicate between them, because the important thing for our purposes is not the chronology of the collapse, but the isolation of the person inside it. Diana was 20 when she married, and 25 in 1986. She had 2 small children. She was the most photographed woman on earth. She was ill. She was living in a system that had, by its own later admission, given her no preparation and no support, and which regarded emotional difficulty as a species of bad manners. She could not talk to the household, because the household reported to her husband's office or to the Queen's office. Talking to her ladies-in-waiting carried the risk of it travelling, because ladies-in-waiting are drawn from precisely the same small pool of families as everybody else in the building. Her grandmother was out of the question, because Ruth Fermoy was the Queen Mother's closest friend and had been for 40 years and had promoted this marriage in the first place. And she could not fully talk to Jane, and this is the tragedy of the 2 sisters, because whatever Jane's private loyalties were, and I have seen no evidence that they were anything other than complete, her husband's job made her a structural risk. Not a spy. Nobody sane has ever suggested Jane Fellows carried tales. But Diana was a young woman with an eating disorder and a collapsing marriage, and a growing certainty that the institution was managing her rather than helping her. And in that state of mind, you do not confide freely in the wife of the Queen's private secretary. You cannot. Not because she would tell him, but because you would spend the whole conversation wondering. Diana's suspicion of the palace men hardened over the decade into something close to a settled worldview. She used the language of an adversary about them. She talked about them, in the accounts that have reached us, as the people running her rather than working for her. And Robert Fellows, by 1990, was the most senior of them. There is one more person who has to be accounted for before we go on, because she connects both ends of this story, and because what she did is the single hardest thing in it to forgive. Ruth Fermoy, born Ruth Gill in Aberdeenshire, was a serious musician. She trained in Paris, she performed, she founded the King's Lynn Festival and ran it for decades, and she was by any measure a woman of real accomplishment in a generation that did not make it easy. She married Maurice Roche, 4th Baron Fermoy, whose family had money from Frank Work of New York, and they took Park House on the Sandringham estate, and she became a friend of the Duchess of York, who became Queen Mother, and she was a woman of the bedchamber and then a lady-in-waiting. And that friendship lasted until Ruth died in 1993. 50 years of proximity, she was closer to the Queen Mother than almost anyone alive. In 1968, she went into a courtroom and gave evidence that helped take her daughter's children away from her. In 1980 and 1981, along with the Queen Mother, she encouraged the match between her granddaughter and the Prince of Wales. And in 1992, when the Morton book had detonated, and the palace needed material with which to question the reliability of the Princess of Wales, Ruth Fermoy was among those who supplied the family perspective, which is a polite way of saying that Diana's own grandmother helped the institution build the case that Diana was unstable. Diana knew, Diana talked about it. Whatever the exact mechanics, the granddaughter believed her grandmother had gone over to the other side, and the belief was not baseless. Now hold that beside Sarah. Both women had a choice between the institution and the family. Ruth Fermoy made it twice, in 1968 and again in 1992, and both times she chose the institution, and both times she was rewarded with continued proximity to it until the day she died. Sarah made it once, at 23, largely by accident, and chose to tell a journalist the truth, and was frozen out for 48 years. There is a reported coda to Ruth Fermoy's life, which I will give you with a heavy caveat, because it comes from Diana, through the same filtered channels as most of this, and cannot be checked. It is said that before Ruth died in 1993, the two of them were reconciled, and that the old woman said something to her granddaughter that amounted to an apology, or at least to a warning delivered too late, about what the royal family's way of life actually did to people who married into it. If she did say it, she was right, and she had known it since 1968. And she had said nothing at the time when saying it would have made a difference. Which left Sarah. Sarah, who had no position to protect. Sarah, who had already been on the wrong side of the household for a decade and had lost nothing much by it, since she had a farm and 3 children, and no ambition to be anywhere near a palace. Sarah, who had been ill in the same way, and could therefore be told the truth about it without the conversation turning into a negotiation. Sarah, who would not fuss, would not weep, would not tell her it was going to be all right, and would say something dry and slightly appalling that would make her laugh. The palace's assessment of the 2 sisters, formed in 1978, had, by the mid-1980s, produced exactly the outcome that assessment should have warned them about. By treating one sister as the safe one and building the relationship there, the institution guaranteed that the Princess of Wales would take her real confidences to the other one. I have no document proving that anybody at Buckingham Palace ever articulated this to themselves. I doubt anybody did. It is not the sort of thing that gets written down, and it is not the sort of thing that gets noticed by the people it is happening to. But it is visible in the shape of the events, and it becomes unmistakable in 1992, which is where we are going next, and which is the year everything the palace had feared about talking Spencers came true in a form nobody had predicted. Because it was not Sarah who talked. Before we get to the book, we have to bury the father, because it happened first, and because it rearranged the family in ways that mattered enormously to what came after. Johnny Spencer, 8th Earl Spencer, died on the 29th of March, 1992. He was 68. He had been unwell for a decade, ever since a cerebral hemorrhage in 1978 that had very nearly killed him, and from which Rain's ferocious management of his care had, by most accounts, including his children's grudging ones, brought him back. Diana was in Austria, skiing with the boys and with Charles. When the news came, there was an argument about whether her husband would fly home with her. He wanted to. She did not want him to. She said afterward that he only wanted to come for the photographs. In the end, the Queen intervened, and Charles flew back with her, and they were photographed arriving together, and then he went to Highgrove, and she went to Althorpe, and that was more or less the last piece of theatre the marriage ever performed. At Althorpe, the children took the house back. That is not too strong a phrase for what happened. Within a very short time of the funeral, Rain's belongings were reportedly outside the door in bin bags, and she was gone, and the 9th Earl Spencer was 27 years old, and in possession of a house he had spent his adolescence watching his stepmother strip. Sarah was 37, Jane was 35, Diana was 30. Their father was dead, their mother was in Scotland, their grandmother was in the Queen Mother's household, and would shortly do something none of them forgave, and the 4 Spencer children were, for the first time since 1967, the only adults in their own family. 10 weeks later, Andrew Morton published Diana, Her True Story. The Sunday Times serialization began on the 7th of June, 1992. And it went off like a bomb under the entire institution. The book said that the Princess of Wales had an eating disorder. It said she had made attempts on her own life in the early years of the marriage. It said Camilla Parker Bowles had been present in the marriage from the beginning, in effect if not always in person. It said the Prince of Wales was cold, distant and indifferent, and that the palace had watched a young woman come apart and had responded by asking her to smile. And the immediate, urgent, all-consuming question at Buckingham Palace was not whether any of it was true. The urgent question was where it had come from. We know the answer now, and it is worth stating plainly, because it is the hinge of this entire video. It came from Diana. She had recorded answers onto tapes. The tapes went to Morton through an intermediary, a friend called Dr. James Coldhurst, who cycled between Kensington Palace and Morton's office carrying them. Morton never sat in a room with her. That arrangement was deliberate, and it was designed to give her deniability, and it worked for a while. Around the tapes, a group of her friends spoke on the record. Caroline Bartholomew, who had shared the flat at Coleherne Court, James Gilby, Angela Sirota, Rory Scott, others. They were named, they were quoted, and Diana let it be understood in the small world that matters, that they had her blessing, most conspicuously by turning up on Carolyn Bartholomew's doorstep for the photographers, a fortnight after publication, which was about as close to a signed confession as it was possible to get without signing anything. Hold on to what follows, because it is the reason the palace's 12-year assessment of the Spencer sisters was wrong from the beginning. Sarah did not talk to Morton. Neither did Jane. Neither did their brother. Neither did their mother at that stage. The 4 members of Diana's blood family, including the sister the household had regarded as a proven security risk since 1978, contributed nothing. The institution had spent more than a decade quietly managing the wrong person. And then it made an error that has never entirely been repaired. Robert Fellows was by this point the Queen's private secretary. He was also, as we have established, Diana's brother-in-law. When the book landed, he did what a private secretary does, which is go and establish the facts. He asked Diana directly whether she had cooperated with Andrew Morton. She told him she had not. And Fellows, on the strength of his sister-in-law's word, went to Lord Macgregor at the Press Complaints Commission and passed on the denial. Macgregor then issued a public statement condemning the press for what he called dabbling their fingers in the stuff of other people's souls. It was a strong phrase, and it was widely quoted, and the entire basis of it was false. When it became clear over the following months that Diana had in fact cooperated, Macgregor was left publicly humiliated, and Fellows was left having staked the credibility of the Queen's office on a denial from a member of his own wife's family. He offered his resignation. It was not accepted. Sit with that for a moment, because it is one of the most painful things in this whole story, and almost nobody discusses it. Robert Fellows married Jane Spencer in 1978, when she was 21, and he was a junior man in the household. 14 years later, his job required him to interrogate his wife's sister, and his wife's sister lied to him, and he repeated the lie in good faith to a public body, and his professional reputation took a wound it carried for the rest of his career. And Jane was married to him and sister to her, and had to live in the middle of that for the following 5 years, in a house inside the same walls as the woman who had done it. I have no idea what was said in the Fellows' house in the summer of 1992. Nobody does. Robert Fellows has said essentially nothing about any of it in the 27 years since he retired, which is a silence of an almost geological completeness. Jane has said nothing either. But you can see the shape of the damage in what happened next, which is that the closeness between Diana and Jane cooled and did not fully recover for years. The palace had built its Spencer policy on the assumption that Jane was the reliable channel. In the event, the reliable channel was the one who got hurt, and the supposed risk sat in Lincolnshire with 3 children and said nothing to anybody. If you are still with me, and I hope you are, take a second to subscribe and turn on notifications so the next one of these finds you. We are about halfway through, and the second half is where this story stops being about a marriage and starts being about what a family does when the institution has finished with one of its own. 1992 did not improve after June. In August, The Sun published a transcript of a recorded telephone conversation between Diana and James Gilby, taped some 3 years earlier, in which he called her Squidgy repeatedly, and the tabloids therefore called the tape Squidgygate. In November, Windsor Castle caught fire. In late November, the Queen made the speech at Guildhall, in which she called it an annus horribilis, and mentioned, in passing, and with a dryness that was very much her own, that she had a sore throat. On the 9th of December, John Major stood up in the House of Commons and read a statement announcing that the Prince and Princess of Wales had separated. The statement said there was no reason why the Princess of Wales should not be crowned Queen in due course, which was a sentence nobody in the building believed when it was written, and which was quietly abandoned inside a year. In January of 1993, a second tape surfaced, this one between Charles and Camilla, and its contents were of a nature that made the Gilby tape look like a parish newsletter. Through all of it, Sarah McCorquodale was in Lincolnshire, unquoted. The 3 years between the separation and the divorce were the years in which Diana had to work out what she was going to be, and the answer she arrived at was that she was going to be independent, and the institution's answer was that there was no such thing. In December of 1993, she gave a short speech at a charity lunch, announcing that she was withdrawing from public life, asking for time and space, thanking the public for what she called their kindness and trust. It was genuinely moving, and it lasted about 6 months before she began accepting engagements again, which the press treated as hypocrisy, and which was in fact something much more ordinary. A 32-year-old woman with no job, no husband, a reduced household, and 2 children at boarding school had discovered that time and space is not a thing you can live inside. In June of 1994 came the Dimbleby documentary, in which Charles admitted adultery on camera to an audience of about 14 million. Diana went out the same evening in a black off-the-shoulder dress by Christina Stambolian that she had owned for 3 years and never worn, and the photographs of her arriving at the Serpentine Gallery ran on more front pages the next morning than the confession did. And then, on the 20th of November 1995, 22.8 million people in the United Kingdom sat down to watch a panorama interview that had been recorded in her sitting room at Kensington Palace 15 days earlier. You know the lines. There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. She would like to be a queen of people's hearts. She did not think her husband could adapt to being king. She admitted her own adultery with James Hewitt and said she had adored him. What matters here is not the content, which has been chewed over for 30 years, but 2 things about how it happened. The first is that the palace did not know. Robert Fellows, running the Queen's office, learned of the interview only days before transmission, when the BBC finally told the palace what was coming. The chairman of the BBC governors at the time was Marmaduke Hussey, whose wife, Lady Susan Hussey, was one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting and among her closest confidants. BBC management deliberately kept Hussey out of the loop precisely because of that connection. The most senior man at the corporation was cut out of the biggest broadcast of his tenure because his wife worked for the woman it was aimed at. Diana filmed it in her own home. The crew came in on a Sunday when the staff were off. She let them in herself. The second thing is how Martin Bashir got to her, and this is where the Spencers come back into it, in a way nobody could have predicted in 1978. He did not get to her through Sarah. He got to her through Charles Spencer, her brother. In September of 1995, Bashir met the 9th Earl and showed him documents purporting to be bank statements, indicating that people close to the Spencer family and to Diana were being paid by the security services for information. The documents were forgeries, mocked up by a BBC graphic designer at Bashir's request. Charles Spencer, believing them, and believing that his sister was being spied on by people around her, made the introduction. That is not a theory. It is the finding of Lord Dyson's inquiry, published in May of 2021, which concluded that Bashir had acted deceitfully and that the BBC had fallen short of the standards of integrity and transparency required of it. The corporation apologized. Charles Spencer has spoken about it at length since, with the particular anger of a man who understands that he was used as a door. So consider the ledger. For 17 years, the institution had carried a file on Sarah Spencer, dating from a magazine interview she gave at 23, on the working assumption that she was the loose Spencer, the one who talked, the risk in the family. In the event, the material that did the institution real damage came out of Diana's own recorded tapes in 1992, and out of Diana's own sitting room in 1995, and the family member who unknowingly opened the second door was her brother, deceived by a forgery. Sarah, across the entire period, contributed nothing to either. On the 20th of December 1995, 1 month after Panorama, the Queen wrote to both her son and her daughter-in-law, advising them, in terms that were understood by everyone concerned to be an instruction, to divorce. Fellows drafted it or handled it. Diana was reportedly shocked to receive it, which tells you something about how far apart the 2 sides had drifted, because from the palace's point of view, the letter was the only remaining conclusion available. The decree absolute came through on the 28th of August, 1996. She kept Kensington Palace. She kept the title, Diana, Princess of Wales. She received a settlement reported at around £17 million, with an annual sum for her office. She lost the style Her Royal Highness. That last one has been argued about ever since, and the argument usually gets the mechanics wrong, so let me be exact. The removal was not a punishment invented by courtiers in a back room. It followed from the divorce itself under the conventions governing royal style, and the decision was signed off at the top. What is in dispute is who pushed for it and how hard, and whether it could have been avoided if anyone senior had wanted to avoid it. What is not in dispute is the practical effect. From the 28th of August 1996, the mother of the future king was required to curtsy to her own son's aunts. She lost her royal protection officers, a decision she was said to have accepted, and later to have regretted. She lost most of her household. Her staff shrank to a handful of people in an office at Kensington Palace. And she needed, on foreign trips, in front of cameras, at hospitals and minefields and hospices, someone at her shoulder who could do the job of a lady-in-waiting. She could not have a lady-in-waiting in the formal sense anymore. That is a royal household appointment, and she no longer had a royal household. What she needed was a woman of the right background who would travel with her, manage the small things, stand slightly behind her at the right angle, and be absolutely and unquestionably on her side. In the last months of her life, on several of those trips, the woman standing slightly behind her was Sarah. By 1996, there was almost nobody left. That sentence needs supporting, so here is the support. After the divorce, Diana's household was reduced to a fraction of what it had been. Patrick Jepson, who had been her private secretary for 8 years and who had held the office together through the worst of it, resigned in January of 1996. Her press secretary went. The number of people working in her office at Kensington Palace came down to a handful. She had no royal protection officers, having accepted their removal, a decision she is reported to have regretted within months. The friendships had also thinned. Some of them she ended herself, abruptly, in the way that had become characteristic of her, where a person who had been indispensable for 2 years was suddenly not returning her calls because she had stopped taking theirs. Others ended because of the Morton book, since the friends who had spoken on the record had put themselves in an impossible position, and some of them paid for it socially. Others ended because being close to Diana in the mid-1990s was an exhausting and slightly dangerous occupation. Her mother was in Scotland, and the relationship had gone through a bad patch that some accounts say was not repaired before the end. Her grandmother had died in 1993. Her father was dead. Her brother had declined her, the house on the estate. The palace was, from her point of view, an adversary. What was left was a small number of women: Rosa Monckton, Lucia Fletcher de Lima, whose husband was the Brazilian ambassador and who was probably the closest of all of them, Annabel Goldsmith, her sisters. And this is where the whole argument of this video lands, so let me put it as plainly as I can. In the last 18 months of her life, the Princess of Wales had a circle of perhaps 6 or 7 people she genuinely trusted, in a world of billions who knew her face. One of them was her eldest sister. That sister was the only one of the 7 who had known her before she was famous, who had been in the house at Park House when their mother left, who had sat in the same nursery, who had had the same illness, and who could not be got at by anybody, because she had no position, no ambition, and nothing to lose. The institution had spent 18 years treating that woman as a liability. The institution had, in the end, made her indispensable. Sarah had been traveling with her intermittently for years before that. She went to Nepal in 1993. She went to Pakistan, more than once, to Lahore, to the cancer hospital Imran Khan had built and named for his mother, which was one of the causes Diana took up in the last 2 years of her life, and which nobody much photographed because there was no glamour in it. Look at what that job actually involved. You get on a plane with your sister, you carry the bag with the spare tights and the paracetamol, and the list. You stand 3 feet behind her in a corridor that smells of disinfectant, while she sits on a bed and holds the hand of a woman who is dying, for as long as it takes, which is often a long time, and always longer than the schedule allows. You do not appear in the photograph. If you do appear in the photograph, you have done it wrong. Then you get back on the plane. It is not a glamorous role, and it was not a paid one, and Sarah did it for a woman who by then had almost nobody left. That is worth holding against the Cupid line and the tea towels line, because those 2 sentences are the entire public record of Sarah Spencer for most people, and they are both from her 20s, and they are both jokes, and neither of them describes what she actually did with the following 20 years. The last summer was a strange one. Diana was 36. She had auctioned 79 of her dresses at Christie's in New York in June and given the money to cancer and AIDS charities. She had walked through a partially cleared minefield in Angola in January in body armor and a visor, and the photographs of that had moved the landmines treaty forward in a way that a great many diplomats had failed to. She was going to do the same thing in Bosnia in August. She had also, in July, accepted an invitation from Mohammed Al-Fayed to take the boys to the south of France, and by the end of that month, she was involved with his son Dodi, and by August, the relationship was on the front of every newspaper in the world, photographed from boats. Her family's view of all this has never been given publicly in any detail, and I am not going to invent one. On the 30th of August, she flew from Sardinia to Paris. At around 23 minutes past midnight on the 31st, a Mercedes carrying Diana, Dodi Fayed, the driver Henri Paul, and the bodyguard Trevor Rees-Jones went into the 13th pillar of the underpass at the Pont de l'Alma. Dodi Fayed and Henri Paul died at the scene. Diana was cut out of the car and taken to the Piti-Salpêtrière hospital, where surgeons worked on her for a long time, and where she was pronounced dead at 4 in the morning, French time. The call reached Balmoral in the small hours. The Prince of Wales was there with his sons, who were asleep, and with the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh. And later that morning, a British Aerospace 146 of the Queen's flight took off from RAF Northolt, bound for Paris, and on it were 3 people. Prince Charles, who had insisted on going, against a certain amount of advice that it was not his place any longer, because they were divorced, and Sarah and Jane. Their brother did not go. He was at his house in South Africa. He would arrive in England in time for the funeral. So the 2 Spencer sisters flew to Paris together to collect their youngest sister, the one the palace had trusted and the one the palace had not, in the same aircraft, with the man both of them had known since they were young women, one of whom had been photographed with him on the front pages of newspapers 19 years earlier. There is no account of what was said on that flight. There will never be one. All 3 of them have kept it, and I think it is the one thing in this entire story that everybody would agree they are entitled to keep. They landed in the afternoon. They went to the hospital. Diana had been washed and dressed and laid in a room on the first floor with candles and flowers, and the 2 sisters and her former husband spent time there. And then the coffin was carried down and put into a hearse and driven to Villacoublay. And the aircraft came back into Northolt at about 7 in the evening, with the Prime Minister and the Duke of York and the Lord Chamberlain waiting on the tarmac, and a guard of honour. And the coffin came down the steps under a royal standard, because the Lord Chamberlain had insisted on it, despite the technical position that she was no longer entitled to one. That week is remembered now mostly for the flagpole, for the crowds in the mall, for the argument about whether the Queen should come to London, for the 4 days of institutional paralysis, followed by the broadcast on the Friday evening in which she spoke, as she said, as a grandmother. What the Spencers were doing that week is much less remembered. They were arranging a funeral, in 5 days, for a woman whose funeral had no precedent and no plan, under a level of public attention that has not been repeated since. There was an existing contingency plan for the death of the Queen Mother, and the palace adapted parts of it, and the phrase used inside the building for what they built out of it was, with the black humor of professionals under pressure, a unique service for a unique person. There were negotiations about the route, about the length of it, about whether the boys would walk. That last one was fought over hard, and I have read 4 different accounts of who pushed for what, and the honest position is that we do not know. William and Harry walked. So did their father, their grandfather, and their uncle. And Charles Spencer got up in Westminster Abbey on the 6th of September and delivered a eulogy that the palace had not seen. He called her the very essence of compassion, of duty, of style, of beauty. He said she needed no royal title to continue to generate her particular brand of magic. He said, of her sons, that her blood family would do all they could to continue the way in which she was steering them, so that their souls were not simply immersed by duty and tradition, but could sing openly. And then the crowd outside started to applaud, and the applause came in through the west door, and it moved up the nave, and the congregation joined it. You can argue about that eulogy. A great many people have. It was a brother speaking 6 days after a sudden death. It was addressed to an institution sitting 10 feet away from him, and parts of it have not aged perfectly, particularly the passage about the family's role in raising the boys, given how the following years actually went. Charles Spencer had also, some years earlier, declined to give his sister a house on the Althorpe estate when she asked for one, a fact that was in the public domain within days, and which a number of commentators pointed out at the time with some relish. But he said the thing out loud, in front of them, in an abbey, on television, and nobody else was ever going to. She was buried on an island, in the middle of an ornamental lake at Althorpe, in ground that had been Spencer land for 500 years, and the family closed the gates. What happened to Sarah after that is, in a way that nobody at the time seems to have found remarkable, that she became an administrator. Diana had made a will in June of 1993 and had named 2 executors, her mother, Frances Shand Kidd, and her eldest sister. Think about the choice. Diana had a brother who owned the family seat and had a head for business. She had another sister married to the most senior official in the royal household, a man whose entire professional life was the administration of complicated estates and delicate arrangements. If you were picking an executor on the basis of relevant qualification, Robert Fellows was one of the best qualified men in England. She picked Sarah. The estate was large. The gross figure reported at the time was in the region of £21 million, reduced by tax to something under 13. The bulk of it went into trust for William and Harry. And then there was a document called a Letter of Wishes, written in October of 1993, 3 months after the will. In it, Diana asked that her chattels, meaning her personal possessions, her jewellery and clothes and pictures and furniture, be divided so that 3/4 went to her sons, and the remaining quarter was shared among her 17 godchildren. The executors went to the High Court and applied to vary the arrangements, and in December of 1997, a judge granted the variation. 2 things changed. The age at which the boys would come into their inheritance moved from 25 to 30, and the godchildren, instead of sharing 1/4 of the chattels between them, received 1 item each. The items were, by the accounts that emerged later, modest: a piece of porcelain, a small painting, objects of the sort that a wealthy woman might have on a side table. This decision has been criticized for 1/4 of a century, and some of that criticism has been extremely sharp, and I said at the beginning of this video that we would look at it without flinching, so let us do that. The case against the executors is straightforward. Diana wrote down what she wanted. She wrote it clearly. She wrote it after her divorce proceedings had begun, and when she had every reason to be thinking about her own mortality, and she did not write it casually. 1/4 of the chattels of a woman with that wardrobe and those jewels was a very large amount of property. What the godchildren actually got was, by comparison, a token. Several parents of godchildren were reported to be unhappy. At least one made their unhappiness known publicly. The variation was granted at the request of the executors, which is to say at the request of Diana's mother and Diana's sister, and the effect of it was that the wishes of the dead woman were set aside in favor of an arrangement the living preferred. The case for the executors is also real, and it is less often stated, so here it is. A letter of wishes is not a will. It has no binding legal force. It is guidance to executors, and it is expressly not an instruction, and any solicitor drafting one will explain that to the client at the time. The variation was made partly on tax grounds and partly on the executor's account, in the interests of the 2 beneficiaries the will actually created, who were 13 and 15 years old, and had just lost their mother in front of the entire world. Diana's possessions were not ordinary possessions. Every object she had touched had acquired, within a fortnight of her death, a market value that had nothing to do with the object. Dispersing 1/4 of them among 17 households, most of them not under the executor's control, would have put an enormous quantity of Diana material into private hands, with no restriction on resale, in the exact period when her name was being printed on plates and scratch cards and margarine tubs. You can believe that reasoning and still think they got it wrong. My own view, for what it is worth in a video like this, is that the executors made a defensible administrative decision and an indefensible communications decision, and that if they had explained themselves at the time, in the terms above, the criticism would have been a fraction of what it became. They did not explain themselves, they said almost nothing. Which is the through line of this entire story. This is a family whose instinct, when accused, is to close its mouth. The Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fund, was set up within days of her death, and the money came in at a rate nobody had planned for. Over the years of its operation, it raised well over £100 million and distributed grants to causes she had worked on, landmines and palliative care, and the treatment of people with HIV, and to a great many small organizations that would never have got near that kind of money otherwise. Sarah was a trustee from the beginning and became chair, and the fund made a series of decisions that went badly. It licensed her name and her signature to commercial products, on the reasoning that if her image was going to be exploited anyway, then the money might as well go to charity. That reasoning is not stupid. The execution produced a Diana signature on tubs of margarine and a memorial lottery scratch card, and the coverage was merciless. Then came the Franklin Mint. The Franklin Mint was an American company producing collectibles, and after Diana's death it produced Diana dolls and Diana plates without the fund's authorization. In 1998, the fund sued it in California. The action failed. The court found that the fund did not have the standing it claimed under the relevant Californian law, and dismissed the case, and there was an appeal, and the appeal failed too. And then the Franklin Mint counter-sued for malicious prosecution, seeking a very large sum indeed. By 2003, the exposure was serious enough that the trustees froze the fund's grant giving. Charities that had been promised money were told the money was not coming, because the fund had to hold reserves against an American lawsuit it had started. Hospices and landmine clearance programs and small AIDS organizations went without for the better part of a year because of litigation strategy. It was settled in 2004, with a sum reported at around £13.5 million, directed to charitable purposes, agreed between the parties. The fund survived. It wound up its operations in 2012 after distributing something in the order of £120 million in grants across 15 years. Sarah chaired that. She wore it. And I want to say something slightly awkward about it, because the easy move here is to be scathing, and the easy move is wrong. Sarah McCorquodale was a farmer's wife from Lincolnshire, with 3 children, and no professional background in charity administration, litigation, or brand licensing. And she was handed, at 42, in the worst week of her life, the executorship of a £21 million estate, and the chairmanship of what became one of the largest and most scrutinised charitable funds in British history, in circumstances where every single decision would be examined by people looking for a scandal. She was not equipped for it. Almost nobody would have been. She did it anyway for 15 years, without a fee, without an autobiography, without a single sympathetic newspaper profile placed by a friendly source. And when it went wrong, she did not brief against her fellow trustees, or blame the lawyers, or go on television to explain herself. The woman the palace had written off in 1978 as the Spencer who could not keep her mouth shut, spent the entire second half of her life doing unglamorous institutional work in near total silence. There is an irony in that, which I do not think the household ever appreciated. Twice in the years after her sister's death, Sarah McCorquodale was put into a witness box, and both times it was the machinery of the English legal system that did it, rather than any newspaper. The first was in the autumn of 2002, at the Old Bailey, in the trial of Paul Burrell. Burrell had been Diana's butler, and before that a footman at Buckingham Palace, and he had been close to her in the way that only household staff can be close to someone in that position, which is to say, he saw everything and was paid to have no opinion about any of it. After her death, a very large number of items belonging to her were found at his house in Cheshire. He was charged with theft. Sarah gave evidence for the prosecution, as executor of the estate. She was in the box for a considerable time, and she was cross-examined at length, and the cross-examination was not gentle, because the defense case was that Burrell had taken the items for safekeeping, and that the family had been careless, disorganized, and in some respects hypocritical about what happened to Diana's possessions after she died. The trial collapsed on the 1st of November 2002, when it emerged that the Queen had recalled a conversation with Burrell from shortly after Diana's death, in which he had told her he was taking papers away for safekeeping. The recollection surfaced, according to the account given at the time, during a car ride to a memorial service. The prosecution offered no further evidence. Burrell walked out of the Old Bailey and into a newspaper serialization deal. In the book that followed, and in a good deal of what he has said since, Burrell made a number of claims about Sarah and about the family's conduct. I am not going to repeat them as fact, because they are his account. They were made after a trial in which he had been the defendant and in which she had given evidence against him, and they have been disputed. He has claimed she said certain things to him about secrets. She has not confirmed it. That is where the matter sits, and that is where I am going to leave it. What is worth extracting from the Burrell affair is a structural point, rather than a gossip point. The institution's silence rule, the one Sarah broke at 23, does not exist to protect the family from lies. It exists to protect them from accounts, and an account given by someone who was actually there is far more dangerous than any invention, which is why the people the machine fears most are never the ones who are hostile. They are the ones who were close. Marion Crawford was close. She had been governess to both princesses for 17 years, and she published a warm, affectionate, entirely uncontroversial book about them in 1950, and was cut dead by every member of the family for the remaining 38 years of her life. William Talon, the Queen Mother's page for half a century, said nothing at all while she was alive. Burrell talked and became a permanent hate figure to a large section of the British public. Sarah, who had talked once in 1978, had by 2002 spent 24 years demonstrating that she would not do it again. And then, 5 years after that, the coroner called her. The inquest into the deaths of Diana, Princess of Wales, and Dodi Al-Fayed opened properly at the Royal Courts of Justice in October of 2007, 10 years after the crash, before Lord Justice Scott Baker, sitting as coroner, with a jury. It happened because Mohammed Al-Fayed had spent a decade insisting that his son and Diana had been murdered by the British establishment, and because a Metropolitan Police investigation under Lord Stevens, Operation Paget, had spent 3 years examining the allegations and had published a report in December of 2006, finding no evidence to support them. Al-Fayed did not accept the report. The inquest ran for 6 months and heard from around 250 witnesses and cost the public purse a great deal of money, and it was, whatever anyone thinks of the man who forced it, the most thorough public examination of a death this country has conducted in modern times. In January of 2008, Lady Sarah McCorquodale was called. She was 52 years old. She had not given a press interview since 1978, and she now had to sit in a courtroom in London, in front of a jury and a bank of reporters and the father of the man her sister had died beside, and answer questions under oath about her sister's private life. She was asked about the state of the relationship with Dodi Fayed and whether there had been an engagement. She was asked about her sister's state of mind in the last months. She was asked about the letters Diana had written and about a note in which Diana had recorded a fear that an attempt would be made on her life in a staged car accident. That note is real, and it is one of the strangest documents in the whole affair. Diana wrote it in the mid-1990s, during the period when she believed she was being watched and her telephone was being tapped, and the substance of it was a prediction of the manner of her own death. The Al-Fayed case leaned on it heavily, and it is easy to see why. Sarah's evidence did not help that case. She was cross-examined by Michael Mansfield, who represented Mohammed Al-Fayed, and who is one of the most formidable cross-examiners of his generation, and she was in the box for hours, and she did not give him what he needed. On the central questions, the engagement, the fear, the pregnancy, the conspiracy, her evidence pointed the other way, and it pointed the other way from the position of a woman who had been with her sister repeatedly in the final year and had no reason whatsoever to protect the institution. That is the detail that closes the circle. The palace spent 30 years treating Sarah Spencer as the Spencer who could not be relied on. And when the moment finally arrived when she was compelled, under oath, in public, with immunity from any consequence, and with the world's press in the gallery, to say whatever she wished about the royal family and her sister's death. What she said was measured, factual, and unhelpful to the conspiracy. The jury returned its verdict on the 7th of April, 2008. Unlawful killing, by the grossly negligent driving of the following vehicles, and of Henri Paul. Nobody involved was ever going to be satisfied by it, and nobody was. Mohammed Al-Fayed rejected the verdict as he had rejected every finding before it, and went on rejecting it until he died. The two families who had actually lost people said nothing at all. I have been fairly hard on the institution in this video, and I want to spend a few minutes being fair to the other sister, because Jane Fellows has been treated by most accounts of this family as a piece of furniture, and she deserves better than that. She married a man she loved when she was 21. He happened to work for the Queen. That is not a moral position. It is a coincidence of the marriage market in a very small social world, and she did not choose to be placed at the intersection of a collapsing royal marriage and her husband's career. What she did with that position, as far as anyone can establish, was hold it. She stayed married. Robert Fellows retired in 1999 and was made a life peer, Baron Fellows of Shocham, and they went back to Norfolk. In the 27 years since, neither of them has published anything, briefed anyone, or given a single account of the years in which they lived inside the machinery of the worst royal crisis of the century, with the injured party living a few hundred yards across the same courtyard. At the funeral in 1997, the two sisters read together from the pulpit. They read a poem about grief and the continuation of life, and their voices were steady, which given the circumstances is remarkable. 20 years later, Jane read again at the memorial service in the Guards' Chapel. And in May of 2018, at St. George's Chapel in Windsor, at the wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, the reading was given by Lady Jane Fellows. That was not an accident of the running order. It was a decision, made by a bridegroom who had been 12 years old at his mother's funeral, to put his mother's sister into the service in the most visible non-clerical role available. Both aunts were there. Sarah was there. So was Charles Spencer. If you want to understand the actual lived relationship between the Spencer aunts and the two princes, that is more informative than any amount of speculation, and it is one of the few pieces of evidence available, because the aunts have never described the relationship and the princes have said very little about it either. Their mother died in June of 2004. Frances Shand Kidd had spent her last years on the island of Sale, off the west coast of Scotland, had converted to Catholicism, had done a great deal of quiet work for charities she never publicized, and had given, in 1997, one long interview about her daughter that she reportedly regretted. She was buried on the Isle of Sale. Her 4 children outlived her. Their brother has been the most public of them. Charles Spencer has run Althorpe as a working estate open to the public, has written a series of well-received history books, has spoken at length and with justified fury about the Bashir forgeries, and has in recent years written with considerable frankness about his own childhood. And Sarah went home to Lincolnshire. She raised 3 children, Emily, born 1983, George, born 1984, Celia, born 1989. She took on county responsibilities of the sort that the wives of Lincolnshire landowners take on, which involve a great many committees and very few photographers. She did the memorial fund work until it wound up. She turned up to family things. In 2018, her younger daughter married in Northamptonshire, wearing the Spencer tiara, the same tiara Diana had worn at St. Paul's in 1981. The photographs went round the world for about a day and a half, and then everyone moved on, which is presumably how the family wanted it. That is the whole of the public record of Sarah McCorquodale since 2008. County work, family occasions, silence. There is a question hanging over the years after 1997 that this video should at least put on the table, even though it cannot answer it, and it concerns the promise made in Westminster Abbey. Charles Spencer told the congregation that the Blood family would do all they could to continue steering the boys in the way their mother had begun, so that their souls were not simply immersed by duty and tradition. The boys were 12 and 15. They went back to Eton and Ludgrove. They spent their holidays at Highgrove and Balmoral and Sandringham. They were brought up, as everyone had always known they would be, inside the institution, by their father and by the machinery around him, with Tiggy Legg Burke providing a great deal of the warmth and continuity in the immediate aftermath. The Spencer aunts were not part of the daily fabric of that upbringing. They could not have been. Two boys in the line of succession, at boarding school, with a father who had custody and an institution with plans for them, were never going to be raised in part by an aunt in Norfolk and an aunt in Lincolnshire, whatever anybody said in a pulpit 6 days after a death. So the eulogy promise was not kept, and the honest thing to say is that it was probably never capable of being kept, and that a man saying it in that state on that day should not be held too tightly to it. What can be said is what the record shows. Both aunts have been at the family occasions. Jane read at Harry's wedding in 2018. Sarah was at the weddings and at the memorials and at the unveiling of the statue in the sunken garden at Kensington Palace in 2021, on what would have been Diana's 60th birthday, standing with her brother and her sister, a few feet from her nephews, on one of the few days in recent years when both princes were in the same garden. Neither aunt has ever commented publicly on the relationship between the two brothers, on the events of 2020, on the books, on the interviews, or on anything else. Charles Spencer has spoken, at length and often, though almost always about his own experience rather than his nephew's. And the two women who were on that aeroplane to Paris have kept, across 29 years, the most complete silence of anyone with a claim to speak. Sarah spent the rest of her life in Lincolnshire, and I want to spend a little time on what that actually means, because a video like this can make it sound like exile, and it was not. Lincolnshire is a large, flat, agricultural county that most of the country drives past. It has good soil, big skies, a great many churches, and not much glamour. The society of it, for a family like the McCorquodales, revolves around farming, horses, shooting, the church, and an enormous quantity of unpaid committee work. That last part is the part outsiders never see. English county life runs on women doing administration for nothing. Hospital trusts, the county show, the parish council, the church roof appeal, the local branch of a national charity, the Historic Buildings Preservation Society, the Young Farmers, the Hunt, the Flower Festival. Somebody chairs each of these and takes the minutes and writes the letters and telephones the difficult person. And in a county like Lincolnshire, that somebody is very often the wife of a landowner who has been doing it for 30 years and expects no recognition for it whatever. Sarah did that. She has done it since the early 1980s, and she is presumably still doing some of it. She has held county appointments of the kind that go to people who have made themselves useful over decades. There is a temptation to be sneering about this world, and I am not going to indulge it, because the alternative to it in most English counties is that the work simply does not get done, and then the hospice closes, and the show is cancelled, and the church roof comes in. But I do want to note what she chose, because the choice is informative. At 23, she had been on the front page of every newspaper in the country as the probable future queen. She was clever, she was funny, she had a voice, she had an address book, and after 1997, she had a name that would have opened any door in Britain, and a story that publishers would have paid a very large amount of money for. She could have had a public life. Any number of women in her position have had one, and there is nothing dishonourable about it. She chose committees in Lincolnshire. 3 children. Emily, who has worked in the charitable sector. George, who took on the farming. Celia, who married in the Spencer Church in 2018, wearing the tiara her aunt had worn at St. Paul's, and whose wedding pictures went around the world for a day and a half before everyone went back to whatever they had been doing. The grandchildren have grown up entirely outside the story, which is presumably the point. And whenever the anniversaries have come round, every 5 years, with the documentaries and the retrospectives and the reissued books and the researchers ringing round the family, the answer from Lincolnshire has been the same answer it has been since 1978, which is nothing at all. Now, before we get to the verdict, I want to do something that most videos in this genre do not do, which is to argue against my own thesis as strongly as I can, because if it does not survive that, then it does not deserve 2.5 hours of your time. The strongest objection goes like this. There is no document. Nobody at Buckingham Palace ever wrote a memorandum saying keep Sarah Spencer away from the Princess of Wales. No private secretary has ever confirmed that such a policy existed. What we have is one magazine interview in 1978, a marriage in the same season that happened to be to a courtier, and then 17 years of events, which can be arranged into a pattern by anyone determined to arrange them. Human beings are extremely good at seeing shapes in scattered data. Perhaps the household simply did not think about Sarah McCorquodale at all after 1978, because she was a private woman in Lincolnshire, and there was no reason to. That objection is serious, and it is not fully answerable. Here is what I would say against it. Institutions of this kind do not need memoranda, and asking for one is asking for the wrong sort of evidence. What they run on is reputation, transmitted verbally between people who have worked together for decades. The royal household in 1990 was substantially staffed by people who had been in post in 1978. Robert Fellows himself was. The press secretary's office had lived through the woman's own interview in real time and had had to handle the fallout. That memory does not need to be written down to be operative. It simply becomes part of what everyone knows. And there is a second piece of evidence, which is negative but real. Sarah Spencer was never given anything. Not an appointment, not an honor attached to the household, not a role in her sister's establishment during the marriage. Her sister Jane's husband ran the Queen's office. Her grandmother had been in the Queen Mother's household for 40 years. Her family had leased a house on the Sandringham estate for 2 decades. In a system that distributes small formal roles to well-connected women of exactly her background, almost as a matter of routine, the eldest daughter of the 8th Earl Spencer, sister-in-law to the Prince of Wales, received nothing at all from the institution across 16 years. That is a conspicuous absence, and it wants explaining. I do not think it needs a conspiracy to explain it. I think it needs only what I described at the beginning: preferences, hardening into habits, becoming weather. There is one more piece of this that I think has never been given its proper weight, and it is the part of the 1978 interview that everybody skips over on the way to the dustman line. Sarah Spencer talked about being ill. She was 23. It was 1978. There was no vocabulary in public life for what she was describing. The national conversation about eating disorders in Britain at that point consisted of a handful of clinical papers and the occasional bewildered feature in a women's magazine, and the general social understanding among people of her class was that a girl who stopped eating was being difficult and would grow out of it. And an earl's daughter, in a magazine with a circulation in the millions, sitting in the hairdressers' and the dentists' waiting rooms of the entire country, said out loud that she had had anorexia. That was not a slip. She did not have to answer that question. She could have said she had been run down, which is what everyone in her position said, and Whittaker would have written it down and moved on. For that, among other things, she was regarded as a woman who could not be trusted with a confidence. 15 years later, on the 27th of April 1993, the Princess of Wales stood up at a conference in London and gave a keynote address on eating disorders. She talked about them as illnesses rather than as vanity. She talked about the shame that surrounds them and about the way sufferers hide. She talked about self-esteem and about women who feel they have no control over anything else in their lives. She did not, in that speech, disclose her own experience. But by 1993, the Morton book had been out for 10 months, and everybody in the hall knew exactly what she was talking about. And she knew, they knew. It was received as a landmark. It was reported around the world as an act of courage by a public figure, using her position to change how a stigmatized illness was discussed. And it was those things. The work Diana did on that subject, and on HIV, and later on landmines, was real work with real effects, and nobody should take it from her. But hold the two moments up next to each other. 1978. A Spencer daughter says publicly that she has had an eating disorder, and the institution's verdict is that she is indiscreet, unsound, and finished. 1993. A Spencer daughter says publicly that eating disorders are illnesses, deserving compassion, and the world calls it brave. The difference between the two is not the subject, and it is not the courage. It is that by 1993, the speaker was the most famous woman on the planet and could not be silenced, and in 1978, the speaker was a 23-year-old whom the machine could afford to drop. I am not suggesting Diana took anything from her sister. There is no evidence of that. and I would not put the idea in your head. Diana spoke about her own illness because it was her own illness, and because she had reached a point where speaking about it was the only power available to her. What I am suggesting is that the family produced two women who broke the same silence about the same thing 15 years apart, and the institution punished one and had no choice about the other, and the difference between those two outcomes had nothing whatever to do with the rightness of speaking. That distinction runs through everything the House of Windsor has done for 100 years, and once you see it, you cannot stop seeing it. The family retains people who injure it. It expels people who describe it. Edward VIII abdicated, took a German title from the abdication settlement, met Hitler in 1937, and was quietly given a governorship in the Bahamas and a pension. He remained a duke. His body was brought home and buried at Frogmore. What the family never forgave was not the abdication or the politics, but Wallace, and the fact that the whole thing had been conducted in the newspapers. Marion Crawford wrote a fond book and was excised so completely that when she died in 1988, no member of the family sent a wreath. Paul Burrell talked and became a national punchline. Andrew Morton was never forgiven, and neither was Diana, whatever was said in public afterward. Meanwhile, a long procession of men who behaved badly toward wives, staff and children kept their titles, their houses, their invitations and their places in the order of service, because they had the sense to do it privately. There is a rule buried under all of that, and the rule is not about morality. It is about the maintenance of a single asset, which is the family's ability to say that nobody really knows what goes on. The moment somebody credible describes the interior, that asset is damaged, and no amount of good behavior afterward repairs it. Sarah Spencer damaged it slightly, once, at 23, by accident, and the file stayed open for the rest of her life. Before the verdict, a word about what we actually know, because a story told over 2.5 hours can start to sound more certain than the evidence underneath it, and this particular story rests on unusually thin ground in places. Here is what is solid. The dates are solid. The births, the deaths, the marriages, the divorce, the custody proceedings, the appointments, the wills, the court judgments, the inquest verdict. All of that is documented, and none of it depends on anybody's memory. The 1978 interview is solid because it was printed, and the quotations from it have been reproduced consistently for nearly 50 years by people who had access to the original. Robert Fellowes' career and the Press Complaints Commission episode are solid, because they happened in public and because Lord MacGregor discussed them afterward. The Dyson findings on Martin Bashir are solid. They are the product of a formal inquiry, with access to the documents, and the BBC accepted them. The inquest evidence is solid because it was given under oath, transcribed, and published. What is not solid I have tried to flag as we went, but it is worth gathering in one place. Charles telling Sarah she had done something extremely stupid is second-hand. Nobody who has repeated it was in the room. The Harley Street examination of Francis after the death of the infant son is reported by people close to the family and has never been denied, which is not the same as being confirmed. Those tea towels come from the Morton book, which means they come from Diana, recounting a conversation years after the fact, and it is attributed to Sarah in most versions and to Jane in some. The exact reason for the Westheath expulsion is family law rather than record. Ruth Fermoy's reported reconciliation with her granddaughter before her death rests entirely on Diana's account of it. And a very large proportion of everything anyone believes about the interior of the Wales marriage traces back to two sources, the Morton tapes and the Dimbleby interview, each of which was produced by one party to the marriage, with the express purpose of winning an argument. Neither is a lie, neither is a neutral record either. There is one further problem specific to this subject, and it is the largest one. Sarah McCorquodale has never given her side of anything. Every account in this video of what she thought, felt, or intended is an inference drawn from what she did. She has not confirmed a single one of them. She may regard the 1978 interview as the great mistake of her life. She may regard it as nothing much at all. She may think the palace was perfectly reasonable about her, or she may never have noticed the household's opinion of her in the first place, having had a farm to run. I have argued that the institution formed a view of her and never revised it. The evidence for that is the pattern of what happened rather than any statement by anyone involved, and I have set out the strongest objection to it already. What cannot be argued with is the negative record, which is the only kind of record a person this private leaves behind. 48 years, one interview at 23, testimony when a court required it, nothing else. You can build a fair amount on an absence that complete. Set Sarah beside the other women who were near Charles in that decade, and the pattern gets sharper still. Georgiana Russell, daughter of a British ambassador, who was written about in 1972 and has said nothing since. Davina Sheffield, who was close to him in 1976, until a former boyfriend sold an account of their relationship to a newspaper, at which point she was finished, through no act of her own. Jane Ward, who worked at the Guards Polo Club, and who was, according to the accounts of the time, effectively removed from his orbit after speaking to a reporter. Amanda Knatchbull, Mountbatten's granddaughter, whom he asked to marry him, and who said no, and who has never discussed it. And Anna Wallace, who was with him through the winter of 1979 and the spring of 1980, who was the daughter of a Scottish landowner, and who rode as well as anyone in the country, and who walked out of a ball at Buckingham Palace after being left standing for most of an evening, and then out of the Queen Mother's 80th birthday party at Clarence House in August of 1980, for reasons that have been described in 100 books and confirmed by her in none of them. Anna Wallace has said essentially nothing for 46 years. Now line them up. Davina Sheffield was destroyed by someone else talking about her and has kept silent anyway. Jane Ward talked and was removed. Anna Wallace had every reason in the world to be angry and has never uttered a word. Amanda Knatchbull turned down the heir to the throne and has never explained why. Sarah Spencer talked once, said nothing damaging, and carried the file for the rest of her life. The rule applies to all of them, and it applies whether or not they did anything wrong, and the price of breaking it is the same as the price of having it broken about you. Davina Sheffield was innocent and was finished. That is not a system of justice, and it was never designed to be one. It is a system for protecting an asset, and the asset is protected by everyone at once. The correspondents of the 1970s did not sit on stories out of deference alone. They sat on them because access was the whole business, and access depended on being trusted by both sides. The families of these young women told them to say nothing, because saying something would damage the family, not the palace. The women themselves said nothing, because they had been raised inside a code that regarded speaking as the one unforgivable failure of manners. Nobody enforces it. Everybody enforces it. That is what Sarah Spencer walked into at 23, holding a cup of coffee, talking to a man in a loud tweed jacket whom she rather liked. So let me put the verdict together, and let me do it in two parts, because a woman who has said nothing for 48 years is owed both. The case against Sarah McCorquodale is not empty, and it should be stated properly rather than waved away. She made the introduction. Whatever she meant by the Cupid line, the fact underneath it is true, and a 16-year-old girl met a 29-year-old prince in a Northamptonshire field because Sarah brought him there. Nobody could have foreseen what came of it, and she is not culpable for it in any serious moral sense, but she did carry it, and she has carried it in public for 45 years, and every account of Diana's life begins with her. On the available evidence, she was not the sister Diana needed in 1981. The tea towels line, if it was hers, is the response of a woman who deals with distress by making it smaller, and a 19-year-old in genuine panic, 6 days before the largest wedding in history, needed something else. The eldest sister in that family had learned very young that sentiment does not change outcomes, and she was right about that. And being right about it was no use to Diana at all. She and her mother set aside a letter of wishes their dead sister and daughter had written in her own hand, and 17 children received a token in place of a share, and the executors said nothing to explain it, while people who loved Diana were left to draw their own conclusions. That was a failure. It was probably an administrative decision made for defensible reasons by exhausted people in an impossible year, but the silence that followed it was a choice, and it was the wrong one. There was also a charitable fund, chaired by her, that froze its grant giving for the better part of a year because of a lawsuit it had chosen to bring in a foreign jurisdiction, and lost. Hospices went without. Landmine clearance went without. That happened on her watch, and no amount of context erases it. That is the case against, and it is a real one. Now the other side. She never sold a word. Not in 1997, when the offers would have been life-changing, and every newspaper in the world was outside her gate. Not in 2002, when Burrell was making money out of the same material. Not in 2008. Not in 2017 at the 20th anniversary. Not in 2022 when the Queen died and the market for royal memoir was at its peak. 48 years, one interview, given at 23, and nothing since. On the day her sister died, she flew to Paris, stood in a hospital room, brought her home, and has never described a second of it. She travelled to Lahore and Kathmandu, and stood 3 feet behind her sister in hospital corridors, unpaid and uncredited, in the last years when the household had been dismantled, and there was almost nobody left to do it. The executorship and the chairmanship came to her because her sister had asked, and she stayed with both for 15 years, through failure and public criticism, and never once briefed a reporter to make herself look better. And when the coroner finally compelled her to speak, under oath, with every protection and every incentive to say something explosive, she told the truth as she understood it, and the truth as she understood it happened to be dull. There is a version of this story in which Sarah Spencer is a footnote, the girl who blew it, the sister who introduced them. That version has been the standard one for 4 decades, and it is lazy, and I hope by now you can see why. The palace did not want Diana talking to Sarah because Sarah had once told a magazine the truth about a relationship and about her own health. On the strength of that, an entire family was sorted into the reliable one, and the risk, and the sorting held for the rest of both their lives. It was wrong in every particular. The sister who talked was Diana, into a tape recorder, in 1991, in her own sitting room, because by then, the institution had left her with no other instrument. The door into Kensington Palace in 1995 was opened by her brother, holding forged bank statements. The man whose reputation was damaged by all of it was the one the palace trusted most, Robert Fellows, who defended his sister-in-law in good faith on a denial that was not true. And the woman they spent 30 years watching went to Lincolnshire, raised 3 children, buried her sister, administered her estate, chaired her fund, testified when required, and said nothing. She is 71 years old now. Somewhere in Lincolnshire this afternoon, there is a woman in her 70s working through correspondence about a village hall, or a hospice, or a county show, who was the front-runner for the throne of the United Kingdom in 1977, who introduced her sister to the man she married, who flew to Paris to collect her body, who administered her estate for 15 years, who was cross-examined for hours in the High Court about the worst night of her life, and who has never once told anybody what any of it was like. There is a kind of discipline in that which the institution, of all bodies on earth, ought to have recognized and rewarded. It was the one thing it could never bring itself to see. She has never written a book. She has never given a television interview. If you searched for a photograph of her from the last decade, you would find a handful, taken at weddings and memorial services, showing a countrywoman in a hat. The institution built a file on a 23-year-old in 1978 and never opened it again to check whether it was still accurate. It was never accurate. That is the whole of it. If you have made it this far, thank you genuinely, and do me one last favor. Have a look at the other videos on your screen now, because there are more stories from inside this family that deserve the same kind of attention, and subscribe if you have not already, so the next one comes to you. The Spencer sister the palace never wanted Diana talking to was the one who never said a word.